Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to start the assembly of this 350 Chevrolet engine. This is the engine we used in the 350 TBI engine disassembly. We bought the engine from an auction, so we had no idea of its past or its history, and we tore it down and we made a video of it. And you can see that on our channel. It was our first video. But now we've gotten it back from the machine shop, and I thought we'd start an assembly. So just a quick rundown on the engine. It was in pretty tough shape when we got it. It had quite a ridge. The crank took a bit of a beating. The crank's been ground 10 thou on the mains and 20 on the throws. It was pretty scratched up. The decks need to be cut, so it's been surfaced. Obviously the rods were resized. We used ARP rod bolts, new pistons. It's been bored and honed 30 thou. The heads have been rebuilt. The usual, all the parts will be new. And that's the way we're going to do it. I don't have a home for this engine, so it'll either be for sale later, or if you have a nice vehicle that needs a TBI engine you no longer want, let me know. Hit me up. Other than that, we'll continue with the video of the assembly. I'm not going to use a bore gauge, mics, and a connecting rod vise because 90% of the people watching this video don't have access to that stuff anyway. Now, granted, your machine shop is, they're the ones that are supposed to do all the hard work and check all this stuff in the first place, and we're just here to double check as we put it together. We'll concentrate on the stuff we're going to use to assemble the engine, and what I use to assemble the engine, and some techniques and so forth. So moving forward, let's take a look at the products we're going to use, or the tools we're going to use, and let's get started. Okay, we're back. I talk a lot about cleanliness, and I use lacquer thinner as a cleaner. I use it in the cylinder walls, I use it on all the parts. It's the best cleaner, and I love this stuff. However, I don't recommend it to anybody because it's hard on you. And if you don't have a well-ventilated area, you probably should not be using this. So I wouldn't, but it's up to you what you want to use, but that's what I use. I also have a different container for it, and of course an abundance of rags. What else are we going to use? Silicone. I like Ultra Black. It's just what I use. We can use some thread sealer, and we're going to use this for the intake bolts, more of the middle ones that are exposed to oil. The head bolt kit I bought actually has sealant on the bolts already, and we'll look at those when we install them. My $16 or $17 eBay ring compressor. Crankshaft socket. I guess you don't really need this. I like them. I use them. If you don't have one, that's fine. You can turn the engine over without it. I use this for the camshaft bolts. It's like a Loctite style product. Still gives assembly lube. I like that for the valve train upper end. Torco. I always use Torco. I love that stuff. I use it for the bottom ends. Are you good at putting your rings on? That's something you want to ask yourself. Do you want to put your rings on by hand, or do you want to buy a piston ring expander tool? I usually do it by hand, but I'm going to try it with a tool this time. And one of the things about putting on piston rings by hand is making sure you don't bend them. You don't want those things to be bent and then trying to force them into the ringland groove. And with a ring compressor, they're just never quite right, it seems like, when you do that. So if you do put them on by hand, make sure they're dead straight before you put the ring compressor on them. Fuel gauge. We can check piston ring end gaps. Okay. I do have a mic and an inside mic I always use to check stuff. So you pay your machine shop to do a professional job for you. They do all this work, and that's what you pay for, right? You shouldn't have to check everything, is a lot of the thought concept out there. But what happens is everybody makes everybody else accountable, okay? So you are accountable for assembling a clean engine. Just because this engine went through a parts washer doesn't mean it's completely clean. The place I use does a good job, but I still go over everything with lacquer thinner. That's me, and I'm responsible for that. Now, talking about the machining aspect of it, most of the stuff is pretty easy. We're talking about a small block Chevy here, so most of the stuff is on mid-size, and what it is you have a high and a low side of measurement that's used either for boring the hole out, like in your rod, or for grinding your crankshaft. People usually keep it in the middle. The bearing clearance of this engine will be right around 2. We can check a couple, but we're going to check with a plastic gauge because most of you probably don't have a bore gauge in your garage. We'll do it that way, okay? But the other thing that you got to protect yourself against, and it's not the machine shop or anything else, is why everybody waves their hands in the air. It's the products we're buying. Now, most of the time, you can tell by feel when you're assembling an engine if something doesn't feel right. But if you can't, or you haven't done this too many times, we'll go over why we do things. So we're going to check clearances with plastic gauge. I know I have a bridge mic here, and actually after all the things I said, I don't know why it's here, but I just wanted to check my piston to deck clearance. I just want to know what the overall compression is. That's, but you don't even need a bridge mic. We could do that with something different. Cleaning brushes, extremely important. This is my Crankshaft Journal cleaning brush. Have something. You can buy those anywhere. You can even get them from the dollar store. Just make sure you blow them up with compressed air after. We'll talk about these frost plugs. Generally, some people that like to detail their engines like the gold frost plug, and if they're installed in the machine shop, when you're painting the engine, I just cover them with that. That's all that those are there for. Okay. One of the big things here, whether you're disassembling or assembling an engine, is rod bolt boots. It doesn't matter to me if you use rod bolt boots or if you use like a 3/8 fuel line. When you're disassembling your engine, you can damage your crankshaft just as easily as when you assemble your engine. And right here I have an example one. I bought this engine from a machine shop that was in this state. Okay, it's a 3.9 Dodge. So if anybody's looking for a 3.9 Dodge, 5th month, 12th day of 87, let me know. I have a short block here. But anyway, something I noticed is, you can see when they disassembled this engine, they probably had the crankshaft more over here and got the rod caught between the crank and the sleeve there with the rod bolt, and that's what damaged that. Always be careful whether you're disassembling or assembling an engine not to hurt it. And that's what caused that. So they've already polished over that. It's funny. You can see it real well, but you can't really feel it that well. We're just going to disassemble that engine and clean it up and put the short block together. But we're not going to talk about that engine. It's not part of this video. Okay, so rod bolt boots. They're very important. So as we go along, we'll utilize all this stuff. Paint. I'm using rattle can paint. Okay. This engine is going to be covered by a big black air cleaner and a big black air hose to the air cleaner, air conditioning brackets, exhaust manifolds. We're really not going to see the engine once it's assembled, which is really a shame because they look really nice on the stand. So we're going to use rattle can paint. We're going to put a heavy coat of paint on it. What I don't like to do is leave a whole bunch of bare metal areas that just turn into rust after the first week they're in the vehicle. I like to keep them clean so when you wash them they look good. So paint. Now if you have a Roadster or something with an open engine bay and you like to show your engine off, consider the Eastwood products. They have a good engine paint. Or talk to your local body shop. I'm sure they can help you with something that stays shiny and looks good for years on end. But we're going to use rattle cans. So anyway, follow along, and we're going to get started on the assembly of this engine. Okay, so let's continue on here. So we were talking about cleanliness initially. Cleanliness is key. Now when you're assembling these engines, like I say, they go through a acid bath, they go through a hot tank, they go through a lot of processes, and then they get bagged up, and then you get them. This is the part where we're kind of responsible for making sure that everything we do, we do everything we can do to keep things clean. You'll never have a perfectly clean engine. I don't think it's even possible. But you can minimize or mitigate any of the debris that ends up in there. For the most part, you have dirt and dust, but you can get lint from your rags. You can get all kinds of things. You can get dirty hands and be working on it. So anyway, we're going to try our best to keep that clean. So when we take the caps off, remember, this was number 4. We have an arrow pointing to the front. It actually has an F there for front. Always check and make sure your caps are in the right location. Okay, so as we unbox stuff and get ready, these are the main bearings we're going to be using. They're a King bearing. It's the part number. Okay. We'll take each one of our main caps off. We're going to clean them up. We'll clean the saddle and the block, and we'll install the main bearings. Remember to clean the block as you're going along, so we'll take a clean rag here. I've already wiped these down once. Some people are going to cringe. I know. We'll clean this up after. Anyway, some of the stuff we were talking about being dirty. So keep it clean. Keep the lint down. Don't go along the sides. We'll talk about that as we go along too. Just a tip. People ask me, do we clean our bearings the same way we clean everything else? We do. When they're packaged up in plastic, or before that, you can see there's an oil substance in there. And there's a bunch of dust in there. So we do clean them up. The other nice thing about your bearings, or pardon me, the other thing you should be doing with your bearings is verify they're the right size and the right bearing number, just in case they were boxed wrong. Okay, so in keeping everything clean, we're going to install these bearings. So put your little tab in the tab point, and just push them in. But we're going to talk about something after we've installed them. Okay? Try and keep them flush. There's an interference fit, and we want to grind on the back edge of this. It's very sharp. We'll talk about that in a second. So when you're pushing in, because these are an interference fit, you could be scraping coating off the back of the bearing. So be careful when you're putting these in. And we will take a look after we put them in. You can even push on them and put a little bit of pressure on them and push them the other way. Okay, so we got these in. So, with that interference fit, do you think there would be a problem? We've already cleaned our saddles, we've already cleaned our bearings. So we're going to put a little bit of lacquer thinner on a rag here. And we're going to go along the edges that we ground into the block. And look at that. So there's always debris. Even when you're assembling something, you can create debris, okay? So remember that. Always double check the work you're doing. Nothing ever goes perfectly, right? So, and especially on the back one here, it can carry a lot of, you can grind it pretty hard on the back. So be careful on that. And wipe it down after you install those bearings in the block. Okay, let's take a look at this crankshaft. It's been in the bag the whole time it's been here. Should be in pretty good shape still. Alright. Here's that bag. So the first thing we want to do is check and make sure our rods are 20 and our mains are 10. So that is correct. Alright. So, like we were talking about earlier, it's up to us to make sure that everything's clean. Or we at least have to do our best to make sure that happens. One of the things I always like to do is just run a brush through every journal. Make sure you go straight in on your brush. Otherwise you'll be playing with it and it'll look silly. Okay? So straight in. Alright. Perfect. Now, I can already see shards of, or pieces of either very dried up oil or it could be metal, I'm not really sure. And I'll show that to you right now. Let's get this off. Sorry about the hand. So just doing that, that's what we got out of that journal. Okay? Now we're going to do that to all 4 of these journals. So this one, this one, this one, this one. All 4 of the rod journals. Okay? They all go through to a main. So if you just do those 4 and then clean them up and clean the crankshaft after, we'll be ready to install it. Okay, real quick before I finish up here. Again, we're just going to take a look again what came out of these journals. It could be nothing. It could just be, like I say, dried up oil. But that's what came out. And then underneath, I just wanted to show everybody what could be inside the crank. So make sure you clean out your crank journals. Okay, so I gave it some thought. So we're going to do this a little bit differently than usual. Most people will say to never, when you plastigate, you want the crankshaft to be dry, and that is correct. However, most people don't consider the fact that the center of the bearing is the thickest part. It actually gets thinner as you get toward the parting line. So if you have a little bit of oil, which we're going to have here, it's not the end of the world throwing oil on one side. Make sure your hands are clean when you do this. Make sure you oil the whole bearing. Really, we're just putting a very small film on here. There's really nothing here. I just don't want to do it dry. Okay. Look for any debris. And if you think you see some, just brush it off. A lot of the time there's really nothing there. And this oil, like I say, we're just there for protection. Okay, so now we'll drop the crankshaft in. Okay, sometimes it doesn't go as graceful as it could. And what we're going to do is we're going to check some bearing clearances, and we're going to check the thrust. Okay, I don't like using these rags for the crank journal. It's just sometimes I find it hard to get in there and wipe anything off. All right, so I'm thinking we're going to torque the mains on, we're going to spin the crank. If the crank spins fine, that's good. If we have some tight spots, we have to address something different. We're going to then plastigate each one individually. And if all goes well, we'll have the proper clearance and we'll be able to move forward. Okay? So at first, we're going to give these a little bit of oil. Then after we torque it up and make sure the crank moves okay, we check our thrust. We're going to wipe this off and plastigate it. One of the things you want to be sure of, you have no debris or dirt anywhere. Everything's clean. And like we talked about before, each one of these caps are numbered, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, and obviously number 5 looks different. It can only go on one way. All right. Okay, so when you're doing this, you want to put some oil on your bolts, right? And a little squirt right there. We don't want the bolt to have any metal-to-metal contact where it could gobble up or give you an inadequate reading. So I always do this. Just a little bit of oil here, a little bit on the threads. You can do it however you've been taught to do it or whatever you think is right. That's the way we're going to do it today. Here. And we'll come back when that heater's stopped. While the guys hit these on with the hammer, I just use a speed wrench and put them in place. Just do it gently, the interference fit into the block, okay? And just take your time, just a little bit of pressure on both sides. That way you have no risk of hurting anything or splitting the cap or anything like that. No issues. Just take your time. Because we're doing this for the sake of testing stuff. We'll start at 30 pounds. This isn't my final torque wrench. This is just the one I use when I'm doing this. The other thing to keep in mind, make sure the socket that you're using is clean. Okay. And then we're going to go to the final. The final torque spec on this is, it's easier just to say torque it up to your manufacturer spec. We're going to torque these up to 70. That was close. All right. So, 70 pounds. It has just oil in it. We have absolutely no tight spots anywhere. It turns beautifully. It spins beautifully. It does everything right, okay? If you have a problem, it's going to have a tight spot. And we have none. So we know our clearances are not too tight already, just by the way it feels and by the simple fact it'll just keep moving, okay? So, let's check our thrust. Okay, we set up our dial bore gauge up front here, okay? We'll check the thrust real quick. I'm going to try and do this one-handed, so it's going to be a little wobbly for a second. All right, bear with me. So what do we have right there? We have 3.5. And we have 0. So we're 3.5 thrust on this. That's not too bad. We'll be just fine at 3.5. I like to see between 4 and 6 most of the time, especially if it goes into a work vehicle. Anyway, 3.5 is just fine. And we're going to continue on with it. So now we know our crank turns. We know our thrust is good. We can check our bearing clearance just so we know what it is. And then we can add some lube and torque down the crankshaft. All right, we'll do number 3. We'll just do the center one first. Okay, we'll buzz those out real quick. So what we want to do now, we'll clean the oil off the bearing. Okay. All right, we'll clean the oil off the bearing. And see, no scratches. That's exactly what we want to see. Nice and clean. And we'll clean the oil off the crank. We're going to want these surfaces dry when we do this. because it's the most accurate reading. However, if you have a little bit of oil, remember, the bearing tapers and it gets smaller toward the parting line. The biggest part of the bearing, or the thickest part of the bearing, is where we're measuring, okay? So that's the other reason it's crucial, if you want an accurate reading, to be dead center. All right? Something to remember. And we're almost out of plastic gauge. It's awesome. Okay. As straight as we can. We've cleaned off the bearing. Number 3, going to the front. We already know that. We're in the center. All right. Let's see what we got. £30 or 35. Okay. We'll do 70. Okay. Perfect. Okay, we can see on here, as well on here, that we have, it looks very good. All right, let's take a look to see what we have here. Looks good, nice and straight. Same on here. All right. So let's measure this real quick. My guess 2 thou. See where we're at here. Well, it's definitely not 1 thou. Let me just switch hands. Okay. So using the gauge that we have, we're not 1. We're not 1 to 5, but we're darn close to 2. We're definitely bigger than 3. So our clearance is right around the 2 mark. Exactly where we thought it was going to be. So if you want to check each one of yours individually, that would be a smart move. If it turns the way this one turned, you're probably fine. We'll check that out. Then we'll put some assembly lube on the bearings and torque it back down. The crankshaft installation will be done. Okay, so we have the same result on every one of these bearings. There's no dirt, there's no marks. And I'm going to post a couple of pictures here of bearings I took out of an engine that had never run. And I'll just put these pictures here, you can take a look at them. And this is what happens when your engine isn't, when you don't concentrate on making sure everything isn't clean. Okay, so one of the things when you're taking these caps off, instead of hammering them or going back and forth, I wasn't sure either. Just give them a little wiggle. We have enough room between the bearing and the plastic gauge anyway. And leave your bolts in, and you'll see why in a second. See when it releases, pull it up when we haven't touched anything, we haven't damaged anything. And we have a really nice line here. Yeah, 192. It's been the same on every one. Maybe 1/8, who knows? But it's absolutely perfect. It feels really good. It measures up really nice. That's exactly what you want to see when you're doing your engine. And we talked about how the engine turns over as well. When it spins over by hand with oil in it. That's a positive thing. If you have oil and you can't do that, you got to start looking at what's going on there. And you'll be able to see it in the bearing. Something will be wrong. Every one of these so far. Oops. We've added assembly lube too when we have them apart. And we'll clean up any areas inside here. Make sure we don't have any burrs. Make sure we have no problems. But we know we don't. I'm not sure the camera's picking up all this, but it's really not that imperative. I think we get the picture. So we've done every one, and you might as well do every one on your engine as well. It's probably the smartest way to go. Just to make sure, but I knew when it was turning over that it was going to be fine. If anything, I thought it might be a little loose, but no, it's really nice. The guy that ground the crankshaft and did the work on this did a really nice job. Again, we'll use the speed wrench just to put it in to seat the cap. A lot of people hammer them. That works too. Remember, all these are at 40. One thing that's nice about the big torque wrench, a lot easier to torque up with. Just double check. Okay, see how it spins. It's still really nice. We can't spin it like we used to though with the assembly loop, but no tight spots. Yeah, it's good. It's really good. All right, we'll double check our thrust. Oops. Perfect. 3.5, 4. Perfect. All right. So we've installed one crankshaft. We'll continue on with the rest of it. We'll start cleaning. Look at that. It even turns nicely when it's just sitting. It still won't spin over like it did with the oil. But that's just because you had assembly lube. Now, if you have a tight engine and tighter clearances, you use a thicker lube, it's going to turn rather tight. But don't worry about it. It's just the lube doing that. Okay? Some of the assembly lube is quite thick. But this is good, and we're going to move forward here. So we'll start with rods and pistons tomorrow, clean up the rest of the block, clean up the cylinders, and getting this thing together. Okay guys, the crankshaft installation part of this video is done. Probably took a lot longer than it should have. I hope it helps a few people out. And recapping everything, if you're going over it in your head, remember 1, 2, 3, 4 arrows pointing forward. Number 5 is pretty self-explanatory. We know that. We know that we're going to oil the threads in the bottom of the bolt here. Make sure we don't have any galling when we're torquing it up. We know that. We know that we want the plastic gauge to be dry when we plastic gauge. We know that too. We know we cleaned everything up and ran a brush through the journals of the crankshaft. We know it's clean. We didn't see any scratch on any bearings. And we know our thrust is 3.5, 4 thou. Right now, we're in really good shape, and I'm really happy with what I'm seeing. We didn't actually have to tear it apart and put a Torco in it, but because I don't really have a plan for the engine, and it might be sitting for a while, I just wanted to make sure it had assembly lube if it was sitting for quite some time. That was really the only reason I redid that part of it, or even added it to there. So if you're firing it up right away, you're probably okay with oil, but you know what? Assembly lube is just that added protection in case something goes wrong. Never a bad idea. We're going to start with the pistons and rods tomorrow, as well as the camshaft and timing chain. Thank you.